She carried their coffee orders on crumpled napkins, memorizing cream and sugar preferences like battle plans. 23 cups every morning, delivered with quiet efficiency, while they joked about the cafe girl who couldn't cut it in the real military. But when Colonel Martinez caught sight of the faded patch beneath her rolled sleeve, his coffee cup hit the floor and the entire forward operating base went silent. Some secrets, it turned out, were too dangerous to stay buried. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun hadn't yet burned through the Iraqi dust when Specialist Elena Vasquez pushed through the heavy canvas flaps of forward operating base Crimson's command tent. Her boots made soft sounds against the plywood flooring, careful not to disturb the early shift communications officers, who were monitoring radio traffic with the kind of intense focus that came from knowing lives depended on every transmission. She carried a plastic tray loaded with steaming cups, each one precisely prepared according to handwritten notes she kept folded in her cargo pocket. Captain Rodriguez liked his black with 2 sugars. Lieutenant Chen preferred extra cream, no sugar. Sergeant First Class Thompson wanted his coffee so light it barely qualified as coffee at all. Elena had memorized every preference during her first week on base, treating each order like classified intelligence that required absolute accuracy. The communications tent buzzed with the constant hum of encrypted radios, satellite uplinks, and the occasional burst of static that made everyone freeze until they confirmed it wasn't incoming fire. Maps covered every available surface, marked with colored pins that represented friendly forces, known enemy positions, and the gray areas in between where anything could happen. Elena moved through this organized chaos like a ghost, delivering coffee and collecting empty cups without interrupting the flow of operations. Specialist Karen Mills looked up from her workstation as Elena approached with her morning coffee. Mills was barely 22, fresh from signal school, with the kind of enthusiasm that hadn't yet been tempered by the reality of deployment life. She accepted her cup with a grateful nod, then leaned back in her chair to study Elena with unconcealed curiosity. "You know," Mills said, loud enough for the nearby workstations to hear, "I still can't figure out what you actually do around here besides play waitress." She took a sip of her coffee, grimaced slightly at the temperature, and continued, "I mean, we're all communications specialists, intelligence analysts, drone operators, real military occupational specialties. But you're like the base barista who somehow got issued a uniform." Elena didn't respond immediately. She finished distributing the remaining cups on her tray, checked her watch, and made a mental note that the next coffee run would be in approximately 90 minutes. The rhythm of caffeine distribution had become as precise as any military operation, timed to maintain optimal alertness levels throughout the shift rotations. "Someone has to keep you functional," Elena said finally, her voice carrying the slight accent that revealed Spanish as her first language. Figured coffee was safer than combat stims. The comment was delivered with such deadpan delivery that it took Mills a moment to realize it was meant as humor. Staff Sergeant David Park, hunched over a computer terminal displaying real-time satellite imagery, looked up long enough to contribute his own observation. "She's got a point about the coffee quality. Way better than the swill they serve at the main chow hall." He gestured with his cup toward Elena. "Question is, where'd you learn to make coffee like this? This is like actual cafe quality, not military-grade motor oil." Elena shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to be both casual and dismissive. "YouTube tutorials. Had a lot of time on my hands." She began collecting empty cups from the previous shift, stacking them on her tray with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. "Amazing what you can learn when you're not busy saving the world." The comment hung in the air with just enough edge to make the nearby soldiers exchange glances. There was something in Elena's tone that suggested layers beneath the surface, But before anyone could probe deeper, the tent flaps burst open and Master Sergeant Patricia Kelly strode in with the kind of purposeful energy that made everyone straighten in their chairs. Kelly was a 38-year-old career soldier who'd earned her stripes in Iraq and Afghanistan, building a reputation for running tight operations and maintaining discipline even in the most challenging circumstances. She had the weathered look of someone who'd spent years in desert environments, with sun-carved lines around her eyes and the kind of situational awareness that came from surviving places where relaxation could be fatal. "Morning brief in 10 minutes, Kelly announced, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of electronic equipment. "Intelligence has updates on the northern patrol routes, and we've got new guidance on communication protocols." She paused, scanning the tent until her gaze settled on Elena. "Vasquez, you're sitting in on this one." The statement caused a ripple of surprised looks throughout the tent. Elena had been on base for 3 months, and this was the first time anyone could remember her being included in an operational briefing. She typically remained in the background, invisible except when delivering coffee or performing whatever. Administrative tasks kept her busy between caffeine runs. "Sergeant," Elena said carefully, "I don't think my clearance level covers operational briefings." She held up her coffee tray as evidence of her peripheral status. "I'm just support staff. Might be better if I stick to what I know." Kelly's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "Your clearance level is fine, Specialist. Trust me on that." She turned to address the rest of the tent. "Everyone else, finish your morning routines and be ready to focus. We've got some developments that are going to change how we operate out here." Elena set down her tray and found an empty chair near the back of the tent, positioning herself where she could observe. Without drawing attention, the other soldiers gradually arranged themselves in loose formation, some still holding the coffee cup she'd delivered, others pulling out notepads and electronic devices to record whatever information was about to be shared. Specialist Jason Wright, a drone operator from Ohio who'd been deployed for 6 months, turned in his chair to study Elena with obvious confusion. "Seriously though," he said, pitching his voice low enough to avoid Kelly's attention, "what's your actual job here? I've been trying to figure it out since you showed up, and all I ever see you do is coffee runs and filing." Before Elena could respond, Private First Class Maria Santos chimed in from her position near the communications array. "Maybe she's undercover quality assurance, making sure we're all properly caffeinated before we make decisions that affect national security." Santos was young, maybe 19, with the kind of nervous energy that came from being deployed for the first time and trying to prove she belonged. "Or maybe," added Specialist Tony Reeves, who operated the base's electronic surveillance equipment, "she's actually a spy from Starbucks, gathering intelligence on military coffee consumption patterns." He grinned at his own joke, clearly pleased with what he considered wit. Elena listened to the speculation with the same calm expression she maintained during coffee distribution. No irritation, no embarrassment, just professional composure. That suggested she'd heard similar comments before and had learned not to let them affect her performance. She checked her watch again, calculating the time remaining until the next scheduled coffee run. "You know what I think?" Mills said, leaning forward with the confidence of someone who believed she'd solved a puzzle. "I think she's someone's niece or daughter. Got assigned here through connections, but there's no real job for her, so they gave her busy work to keep her out of trouble." She looked around the tent, seeking validation for her theory. "Makes sense, right? Explains why she's here but not really here." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, the base's executive officer, who entered with the kind of measured stride that suggested important business. Harrison was a West Point graduate in his mid-30s, with the lean build of someone who took physical fitness seriously and the analytical demeanor of someone who'd spent his career in intelligence operations. "Good morning, everyone," Harrison said, positioning himself near the large tactical map that dominated one wall of the tent. "We've received updated intelligence regarding enemy movement patterns in our operational area, and I need to bring you up to speed on some changes to our mission parameters." Elena shifted in her chair, pulling a small notebook from her cargo pocket. The movement was automatic, professional, the kind of habit that came from years of taking notes during briefings. But several soldiers noticed the action, and their expressions shifted from casual curiosity to genuine puzzlement. "Wait," Wright said, his voice carrying just loud enough for the front of the tent to hear. "Why is the coffee girl taking notes at an operational briefing?" He looked around the tent, seeking support for his confusion. "Is this some kind of training exercise? Are we supposed to pretend she's qualified to be here?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a weapon discharge. Elena's pen paused over her notebook, and for the first time since arriving on base, something that might have been annoyance flickered across her features. But it was gone so quickly that most observers would have missed it, replaced by the same professional composure that had defined her interactions for 3 months. Master Sergeant Kelly turned toward Wright with the kind of expression that made experienced soldiers reconsider their life choices. "Specialist Wright," she said, her voice carrying the weight of 3 decades in uniform, "I recommend you focus on your own responsibilities and let me worry about personnel assignments." But Wright was young enough to believe that persistence was the same as courage, and he pressed forward with the kind of determination that more experienced soldiers would have recognized as dangerous. "I'm just saying, Sergeant, it seems weird that someone who's been making coffee runs for 3 months is suddenly sitting in on classified briefings. What if she's not cleared for this information? What if you shut your mouth and pay attention to the briefing?" Kelly interrupted, her voice dropping to the kind of dangerous quiet that preceded career-ending disciplinary action. "Because right now, you're about 30 seconds away from finding out what permanent latrine duty looks like." Wright's face flushed red, but he had enough sense to recognize when he'd pushed too far. He turned back toward the front of the tent, but his shoulders remained rigid with the kind of wounded pride that comes from being publicly corrected. Around him, other soldiers exchanged glances that suggested they shared his confusion, even if they were smart enough not to voice it. Elena had returned to her note-taking, apparently unaffected by the exchange. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her handwriting was precise, methodical, the kind of systematic documentation that suggested formal training in information processing. She recorded details about patrol routes, enemy activity patterns, and communication protocols with the same attention to detail she applied to coffee preferences. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison cleared his throat and continued with his briefing, but the tension in the tent remained palpable. Several soldiers kept stealing glances at Elena, trying to reconcile the woman they'd dismissed as support staff with someone who apparently had clearance for operational intelligence. The cognitive dissonance was obvious, but no one seemed to know how to address it. "The northern route has seen increased IED activity," Harrison explained, pointing to specific locations on the tactical map. 3 incidents in the past week, all targeting supply convoys. Intelligence suggests coordinated planning, possibly indicating a more sophisticated enemy presence than we initially assessed. Elena's pen moved across her notebook, capturing details that most of the tent's occupants would struggle to remember. Without written reference, she noted grid coordinates, timeline information, and tactical assessments with the kind of systematic thoroughness that came from understanding the value of accurate record-keeping in operational environments. Specialist Mills leaned toward Santos and whispered, "Look at her taking notes like she actually knows what any of this means." The comment was intended to be quiet, but in the confined space of the tent, it carried further than Mills intended. Elena looked up from her notebook, meeting Mills' gaze with steady brown eyes that held no anger or defensiveness, Just professional acknowledgement of a comment that didn't require response. She returned to her writing without speaking, but something in her expression suggested that she understood exactly what the tactical briefing meant, and perhaps understood it better than some of the soldiers who'd been questioning her presence. The briefing continued for another 20 minutes, covering communication protocols, supply schedules, and coordination procedures with other coalition forces in the area. Elena took notes throughout, occasionally asking clarifying questions. That demonstrated detailed understanding of military operations and intelligence procedures. Her questions were precise, relevant, and delivered with the kind of professional competence that gradually shifted the atmosphere in the tent. "Specialist Vasquez," Harrison said during a pause in his presentation, "you had a question about the Eastern checkpoint procedures?" Elena looked up from her notebook, her expression neutral but focused. "Yes, sir. The new authentication protocols you mentioned for vehicles approaching from the eastern sector. Are those going to be coordinated with the Iraqi security forces, or are we handling primary verification internally?" The question demonstrated understanding of both tactical operations and diplomatic considerations that surprised several soldiers in the tent. It wasn't the kind of question someone would ask if they were simply making coffee runs and filing paperwork. It required knowledge of security procedures, international cooperation protocols, and the complex political dynamics that governed military operations in occupied territory. Harrison nodded approvingly. "Good question. We'll be coordinating with Iraqi forces for primary identification, but maintaining secondary verification internally. The goal is to demonstrate partnership while ensuring security standards." Elena made notes in her notebook, then looked up again. "What about backup procedures if communication with Iraqi forces is compromised? Are we authorized to proceed with unilateral verification, or do we hold vehicles until contact is reestablished?" The question prompted several soldiers to exchange glances that suggested growing puzzlement about Elena's apparent expertise. Wright, still smarting from his earlier reprimand, stared at her with unconcealed confusion. Mills had stopped whispering to Santos and was now paying attention to the exchange with obvious interest. "Backup procedures default to unilateral verification," Harrison replied, "but with enhanced documentation requirements. Any vehicles processed without Iraqi coordination need to be reported through intelligence channels within 4 hours." Elena nodded and made additional notes. "Understood, sir. Should those reports include passenger manifests and cargo documentation, or just vehicle identification and transit details?" The specificity of her questions was beginning to attract attention from throughout the tent. These weren't the kinds of details that someone would know from casual exposure to military operations. They required understanding of intelligence procedures, security protocols, and administrative requirements that took months or years to master. Master Sergeant Kelly watched this exchange with an expression that suggested she wasn't surprised by Elena's questions, but was interested in how the rest of the tent was responding to them. Several soldiers were now studying Elena with the kind of focused attention they'd never shown during her previous 3 months on base. "Full documentation," Harrison confirmed. "Intelligence wants comprehensive records of all checkpoint activities, especially anything that deviates from standard procedures." He paused, studying Elena with renewed interest. "You seem familiar with intelligence reporting requirements, specialist." Elena shrugged, the same casual gesture she'd used earlier when discussing coffee preparation. "You pick things up," she said simply. "Amazing what you learn when you pay attention to the details." The comment echoed her earlier response about learning coffee techniques from YouTube tutorials, but the context was entirely different. No one in the tent believed that intelligence procedures were something you learned from casual observation or online videos. Such knowledge required formal training, operational experience, and security clearances that took extensive background investigations to obtain. Specialist Reeves, who'd been silent since his earlier joke about corporate espionage, raised his hand tentatively. "Sergeant," he said, addressing Kelly, "I don't want to sound stupid, but what exactly is Specialist Vasquez's job here? Because she's asking questions that sound like she's got intelligence training, but I thought she was just what?" Kelly asked, her voice carrying a warning tone that suggested dangerous territory. Reeves looked around the tent, seeking support from his fellow soldiers, but found only cautious expressions that suggested no one wanted to be the next person to challenge the chain of command. "I mean, we all thought she was just support staff. Coffee runs, filing, that kind of thing. But now she's asking questions about intelligence procedures like she's been doing this for years." The observation captured what everyone in the tent was thinking, but had been afraid to articulate. Elena had been present on base for 3 months. Visible but invisible, performing tasks that seemed designed to keep her busy rather than contribute to the mission. Now suddenly, she was demonstrating knowledge that contradicted everything they'd assumed about her role and qualifications. Elena closed her notebook and looked around the tent, meeting the curious gazes of soldiers who dismissed her as irrelevant for 3 months. Her expression remained calm, professional, but something in her eyes suggested that she was making decisions about how much to reveal and how much to keep hidden. "I do what needs doing," she said finally. "Sometimes that's coffee. Sometimes it's other things." She stood up, straightening her uniform with the kind of automatic precision that came from years of military service. "Is there anything else you need from me, Sergeant?" Kelly shook her head. "That's all for now, Specialist. Same time tomorrow for the next update." Elena nodded and moved toward the tent exit, but paused near the flaps to look back at the assembled soldiers. "By the way," she said, her voice carrying just enough volume to reach everyone in the tent, "the coffee will be ready in about an hour. Same preferences as always." She left the tent with the same quiet efficiency she'd demonstrated for 3 months, but something had changed in the atmosphere she left behind. The soldiers who'd been speculating about her role and qualifications now found themselves with more questions than answers, and the comfortable assumptions they'd made about the woman who brought them coffee had been quietly but thoroughly demolished. Wright stared at the tent flaps through which Elena had disappeared, then turned to Mills with an expression of complete bewilderment. Did that just happen? Did the coffee girl just demonstrate more intelligence expertise than half the people in this tent? Mills didn't respond immediately. She was thinking about the questions Elena had asked, the way she'd taken notes, the casual competence she'd displayed when discussing complex operational procedures. Nothing about the interaction matched the mental image of someone who'd been assigned to coffee duty because she couldn't handle real military responsibilities. "Maybe," Mills said slowly, "we've been making some wrong assumptions about who she is and what she's doing here." She looked around the tent, noting the expressions of confusion and curiosity on the faces of her fellow soldiers. "Maybe we've been so focused on what we thought we knew that we missed what was actually happening." The comment resonated through the tent like a stone dropped in still water. For 3 months, Elena had been invisible to them, defined by the menial tasks she performed, rather than the qualifications she might possess. Now, suddenly, they were confronted with evidence that challenged everything they'd assumed about her presence on base. Staff Sergeant Park, who'd been quiet throughout the briefing, finally spoke up with the kind of thoughtful tone that suggested he'd been processing the implications of what they'd witnessed. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking about something. Has anyone ever actually asked her about her background? Her training, her previous assignments, her qualifications?" The question hung in the air without response. Everyone in the tent realized that they'd spent 3 months making assumptions about Elena without ever seeking actual information about her military experience or credentials. They'd constructed an entire narrative about who she was based on the tasks she performed, without considering the possibility that those tasks might not reflect her actual capabilities. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who'd been observing this exchange with professional interest, cleared his throat to regain attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years managing complex operations, "I think today's briefing has provided some valuable lessons about assumptions and situational awareness." He paused, scanning the tent to ensure he had everyone's attention. In intelligence work, we constantly guard against the tendency to see what we expect to see rather than what's actually there. Today, you've all been reminded that first impressions can be misleading, and that professional competence doesn't always announce itself loudly. The observation was clearly intended as both education and mild criticism. Everyone in the tent understood that they'd been caught making judgments based on incomplete information, and that their assumptions had prevented them from recognizing capabilities that were apparently hiding in plain sight. As the soldiers began to disperse, returning to their individual workstations and responsibilities, the conversation continued in smaller groups. Elena had become a puzzle that demanded solution, a mystery that challenged their understanding of how military assignments worked and who was qualified to perform which tasks. But Elena herself remained absent from these discussions, having returned to whatever duties occupied her time between coffee runs. The woman who'd quietly demolished their assumptions about her qualifications was now invisible again, leaving them to wrestle with the implications of what they'd witnessed and the uncomfortable realization that they'd spent 3 months overlooking someone who might be far more qualified than they'd imagined. The morning sun continued its climb toward another scorchingly rocky day, and the business of military operations continued with its usual rhythm of briefings, communications, and strategic planning. But something had shifted in the social dynamics of forward operating Base Crimson, and the soldiers who dismissed Elena as irrelevant were beginning to understand that their comfortable assumptions about roles and qualifications might need serious revision. Tomorrow would bring another coffee run, another opportunity to observe and speculate about the woman who'd quietly challenged their preconceptions. But now they would be watching with different eyes, looking for clues about who she really was, and what she was really doing on a forward operating base in one of the most dangerous regions of Iraq. The questions they'd avoided asking for 3 months were finally demanding answers. And Elena Vasquez was about to discover that invisibility was much harder to maintain once people started paying attention to the details they'd previously ignored. Sometimes the most effective disguise was simply doing exactly what people expected you to do, until the moment came when expectations were no longer sufficient to explain what they were seeing. The game was changing, and everyone involved was about to learn new rules about assumptions, respect, and the dangerous art of underestimating people who preferred to work in the shadows. Elena had spent 3 months being invisible, but invisibility was about to become a luxury she could no longer afford. As the last soldier left the briefing tent, Master Sergeant Kelly remained behind, studying the tactical map with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was thinking about more than patrol routes and enemy positions. She'd watched Elena's performance during the briefing, noted the precision of her questions and the competence of her observations, and she was beginning to understand that the next few days were going to be very interesting indeed. The coffee girl, it seemed, had depths that none of them had bothered to explore. That oversight was about to be corrected, whether Elena wanted the attention or not. Sometimes the best way to stay hidden was to be so visible that people stopped seeing you, but that strategy only worked as long as you never demonstrated the skills you were trying to conceal. Elena had just revealed more than she'd intended, and the consequences of that revelation were about to reshape the dynamics of everything that happened on forward operating Base Crimson. The soldiers who dismissed her as irrelevant were about to learn that some secrets were too significant to stay buried, and that the most dangerous assumptions were the ones that prevented you from seeing what was right in front of you. The morning briefing was over, but the real education was just beginning. The heat shimmered off the concrete landing pad as Colonel Gabriel Martinez stepped down from the Black Hawk helicopter, his boots hitting the ground with the solid impact of someone accustomed to making dramatic entrances. Dust swirled around him in miniature tornadoes, kicked up by the rotor wash that gradually subsided as the aircraft powered down its engines. Martinez was a career soldier in his late 40s, built like someone who'd spent decades maintaining the kind of physical standards that impressed younger officers and intimidated potential enemies. His reputation preceded him wherever he went, and forward operating base Crimson had been buzzing with anticipation since word arrived that he'd be conducting a surprise inspection. Martinez specialized in evaluating special operations readiness, which meant his visits typically resulted in either commendations for exceptional performance or comprehensive restructuring for units that failed to meet his exacting standards. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez hurried across the landing pad to greet the arriving colonel, clipboard in hand and sweat already beading on his forehead despite the early morning hour. The temperature was climbing toward another day that would peak somewhere north of 120 degrees, and the desert wind carried the familiar mixture of dust, diesel fuel, and the indefinable smell of military operations conducted in hostile territory. "Colonel Martinez, welcome to Phobe Crimson," Rodriguez said, snapping to attention with the kind of precision that suggested extensive rehearsal. "Major Thompson sends his compliments and requests the honor of your presence for a briefing at your earliest convenience." Martinez returned the salute with practiced efficiency, then immediately began scanning the base layout with the analytical gaze of someone who could assess operational readiness from architectural details and equipment placement. His eyes moved methodically across vehicle staging areas, communication arrays, defensive positions, and personnel flow patterns with the kind of systematic attention that made base commanders nervous. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant," Martinez replied, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I'll want that briefing, but first I need coffee. Real coffee, not the industrial sludge that passes for caffeine in most military installations." He shouldered his equipment bag with casual ease. "Point me toward whoever's responsible for keeping this place properly caffeinated." Rodriguez felt a moment of confusion, unsure whether the colonel was joking or actually prioritizing coffee over operational briefings. "Sir, I can escort you to the mess tent, or if you prefer, we can arrange for refreshments to be brought to the command post." "Neither," Martinez said, already walking toward the main base area with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly where he was going despite never having been there before. "I want to see how this place really operates, and you learn more about a unit from their coffee preparation than from their formal briefings." The statement was delivered with enough conviction to suggest that Martinez had developed this philosophy through years of experience evaluating military installations. Rodriguez hurried to match his pace, mentally reviewing everything he knew about coffee-related operations on base, while trying to figure out how to direct a visiting colonel towards Specialist Vasquez without having to explain why their most competent coffee preparation was being handled by someone whose official duties remained mysteriously undefined. As they walked through the base's main thoroughfare, passing prefabricated buildings and fortified positions, Martinez maintained a running commentary about what he observed. His remarks demonstrated the kind of detailed knowledge that came from decades of military service and extensive experience in combat zones. "Good sight lines from that guard tower," he noted, gesturing toward an elevated position that overlooked the eastern approach. "Smart placement for interdicting vehicle approaches, but I'd want additional coverage for the northwestern sector." He paused to study a communications array. Solid equipment configuration, properly hardened against electromagnetic interference. Rodriguez nodded along, trying to keep pace with both Martinez's walking speed and his analytical observations. The colonel was clearly conducting an informal evaluation of base operations while ostensibly looking for coffee. which suggested a more sophisticated inspection methodology than the formal briefings and equipment reviews that typically accompanied high-level visits. They approached the communications tent just as Elena emerged through the canvas flaps, carrying her familiar plastic tray loaded with steaming cups. She'd completed her morning coffee distribution and was returning to collect empty cups from the previous shift, moving with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized her routine for 3 months. Martinez stopped abruptly, his attention focusing on Elena with the sudden intensity of a predator spotting prey. Something about her bearing, her movement patterns, or perhaps just the professional competence with which she handled her duties, had triggered recognition protocols that operated below conscious awareness. "Soldier," he called out, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made people stop whatever they were doing and pay attention. Elena turned toward him, her expression shifting from routine task focus to professional acknowledgement of a senior officer's presence. "Yes, sir," she replied, coming to a position of attention that was correct without being theatrical. Her posture demonstrated military bearing that had been refined through years of practice, though most observers would have attributed it to basic training rather than operational experience. Martinez approached her with measured steps, studying her face with the kind of analytical attention he'd been applying to base infrastructure. There was something familiar about her features, something that triggered half-formed memories of classified briefings and redacted personnel files that existed in the shadowy areas between official military records and special operations documentation. "I'm Colonel Martinez," he said, stopping directly in front of her. "I understand you're responsible for coffee operations on this base." The statement was phrased as fact rather than question, delivered with the tone of someone who'd already decided she was exactly who he'd been looking for. "Among other things, sir," Elena replied carefully, "I try to keep people properly caffeinated." She gestured toward the cups on her tray. "Would you like some coffee? I can prepare it however you prefer." Martinez nodded, but his attention wasn't focused on the coffee offer. His gaze had shifted to Elena's uniform, specifically to her left sleeve where the fabric was rolled up to accommodate the desert heat. Most soldiers rolled their sleeves in identical fashion, creating neat cuffs that maintained professional appearance while providing relief from the oppressive temperature. But as Elena moved to adjust her grip on the coffee tray, the rolled fabric shifted slightly, revealing a small section of dark material sewn into the inside of her sleeve. It was barely visible, just a glimpse of something that most observers would dismiss as standard military insignia or perhaps a name tape that had been repositioned for comfort. Martinez saw it differently. His eyes locked onto that small patch of dark fabric with the kind of focused intensity that comes from recognizing something significant in an unexpected context. The color was wrong for standard military patches. Too dark, too subdued. The placement was unusual, positioned on the inside of the sleeve where it would be hidden during normal wear. "Specialist," he said, his voice taking on a different quality, more focused, more serious. "Would you mind showing me that patch on your sleeve?" Elena's expression didn't change, but Rodriguez noticed a subtle shift in her posture, a tightening around her eyes that suggested sudden wariness. She glanced down at her sleeve, then back up at Martinez with the kind of careful neutrality that people adopt when they're not sure what information is safe to reveal. "Sir, I'm not sure what you're referring to," she said, though her tone suggested she knew exactly what he meant. "Standard unit patches are on the right sleeve. Left sleeve is just name tape and rank insignia." Martinez stepped closer, close enough to study the partially concealed patch without invading her personal space. What he could see was just a fragment, but it was enough to trigger recognition that sent his pulse rate climbing and caused him to reassess everything he thought he knew about personnel assignments at Forward Operating Base Crimson. The visible portion showed part of a stylized design rendered in colors that weren't found on any standard military insignia. Too dark for regular units, too specific for generic patches, too professional for novelty items. This was something that had been issued by organizations that didn't advertise their existence through official channels. Specialist Vasquez, Martinez said, reading her name tape while maintaining steady eye contact. I need you to show me that patch now. The direct order carried enough authority to make refusal impossible, but Elena hesitated for several seconds before setting down her coffee tray and slowly rolling up her sleeve to reveal the concealed insignia. What emerged from beneath the fabric was small, probably no bigger than a standard postage stamp, but intricate enough to convey significant information to anyone who knew how to read the symbols. The patch showed a stylized eagle in flight, rendered in dark green and black with silver accents that caught the morning sunlight. But this wasn't the standard eagle found on military insignia. This eagle was diving, talons extended, with details that suggested both predatory efficiency and precise targeting capabilities. Beneath the eagle, barely legible text identified the unit designation in letters small enough to require close examination. Rodriguez stared at the patch with complete bewilderment, having never seen anything like it in his 6 years of military service. The design elements were clearly military in origin, but they didn't match any unit insignia he'd encountered during assignments in Germany, Kuwait, or Iraq. The professional quality suggested official issuance, but the subdued colors and hidden placement indicated something outside normal military hierarchies. Martinez stared at the patch for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. His face went through a series of expressions that Rodriguez had never seen on a senior officer. First recognition, then surprise, then something that looked suspiciously like respect mixed with disbelief. Reconnaissance Squadron 7, Martinez said quietly, his voice barely audible over the ambient noise of base operations. Ghost Wing. He looked up from the patch to meet Elena's steady gaze. That unit doesn't exist. Elena didn't respond immediately. She stood there with her sleeve rolled up, the patch fully visible in the desert sunlight, meeting Martinez's stare with the kind of calm composure that comes from having survived situations where panic could be fatal. When she finally spoke, her voice carried no pride or defensiveness, just quiet acknowledgement of fact. Officially, sir, you're correct, she said. Ghost Wing was never activated, never deployed, never conducted operations in any theater. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Unofficially, we spent 3 years doing things that never happened in places that don't appear on any maps. The admission hung in the desert air like smoke from a distant fire. Rodriguez felt his understanding of reality shift as he tried to process the implications of what he'd just heard. The woman who'd been delivering coffee for 3 months, who'd been dismissed as support staff by everyone on base, was apparently a veteran of military operations so classified that they officially didn't exist. Martinez continued staring at the patch with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was accessing memories from classified briefings and restricted personnel files. Ghost Wing wasn't just another special operations unit. It was the kind of organization that existed in the spaces between official military structures and civilian intelligence agencies, conducting operations that required complete deniability and absolute operational security. What was your operational specialty? Martinez asked, his tone suggesting that he already suspected the answer but needed confirmation. Deep reconnaissance, Elena replied without hesitation. Long-range surveillance, target assessment, intelligence gathering in contested environments. She rolled her sleeve back down, concealing the patch beneath the standard military fabric. We went places where regular units couldn't operate and brought back information that regular channels couldn't obtain. Rodriguez felt his mouth go dry as he tried to reconcile this information with everything he'd observed about Elena during her 3 months on base. The woman who'd memorized coffee preferences and filed administrative paperwork had apparently spent years conducting the kind of operations that existed only in classified documents and redacted mission reports. How? Many deployments? Martinez continued, his questions taking on the character of a formal debriefing rather than casual conversation. 17 missions across 4 theaters, Elena said, her voice maintaining the same flat, professional tone. Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, and 1 location that I'm not authorized to discuss even with you, sir. She met his gaze directly. Average mission duration was 43 days. Longest was 4 months. We had a 96% success rate for intelligence gathering and a 100% survival rate for personnel extraction. The statistics were delivered with the kind of precision that comes from extensive after-action reporting and mission analysis. Each number represented weeks or months of dangerous operations conducted behind enemy lines, in environments where capture meant death and mission failure could compromise broader strategic objectives. Martinez ran calculations in his head, trying to determine how many years of operational experience were represented by 17 long-range reconnaissance missions. Deep reconnaissance deployments weren't brief assignments. They required extensive preparation, months of operational activity, and comprehensive debriefing periods that could extend for weeks after mission completion. When did you rotate out? Of Ghost Wing? He asked, though he was beginning to understand why Elena's presence on a forward operating base had seemed incongruous with her apparent qualifications. 3 years ago, Elena replied. Medical separation following complications from the Yemen operation. She gestured toward her left leg in a way that suggested old injuries. Took 18 months of rehabilitation before I was cleared for limited duty assignments. The phrase medical separation carried specific implications in military medicine. It meant injuries serious enough to prevent continuation of normal duties, but not severe enough to warrant complete disability discharge. For special operations personnel, medical separation typically represented the end of active career progression and reassignment to administrative or support roles. Rodriguez was beginning to understand why Elena had seemed overqualified for coffee distribution duties. She wasn't someone who'd been assigned to support roles because she lacked capabilities. She was someone whose operational career had been ended by injuries sustained during classified missions, leaving her with extensive experience but physical limitations that prevented return to active combat roles. Current assignment status? Martinez asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Temporary duty pending permanent reassignment, Elena said. They needed someone with security clearance for administrative support, and I needed somewhere to serve out my remaining enlistment time. She shrugged with the same casual gesture that had characterized her response to questions about coffee preparation. Seemed like a mutually beneficial arrangement. Martinez nodded slowly, pieces of a complex puzzle falling into place in his mind. Elena's presence on forward operating base Crimson wasn't the result of family connections or administrative error. She was a highly qualified special operations veteran who'd been assigned to support duties because her operational career had been ended by combat injuries. The realization explained everything that had seemed incongruous about her behavior during the previous 3 months. Her professional competence, her detailed knowledge of intelligence procedures, her calm response to operational briefings, her ability to maintain situational awareness while performing routine tasks. She wasn't someone learning military procedures through casual observation. She was someone with years of experience operating at the highest levels of military effectiveness. Specialist Vasquez, Martinez said, his voice taking on the formal tone used for official communications. I need to speak with your commanding officer immediately. He turned toward Rodriguez. Staff Sergeant, escort me to Major Thompson's office. We have personnel assignments that require immediate review. Rodriguez nodded, though he was still processing the implications of what he'd witnessed. The conversation. had transformed Elena from a peripheral figure into someone whose qualifications apparently warranted direct intervention from a visiting colonel. He wasn't sure what protocols governed such situations, but he understood that significant changes were about to occur. Elena picked up her coffee tray, preparing to continue with her routine duties, despite having just revealed information that would fundamentally alter her status on base. "Sir," she said, addressing Martinez with the same professional courtesy she'd maintained throughout their exchange. "Will there be anything else you need from me?" Martinez studied her for a moment, noting the way she'd returned to routine task focus despite having just discussed classified operations and career-ending injuries. There was something admirable about her ability to compartmentalize, to maintain professional function regardless of external circumstances. "Actually, yes," he said. "I want you to attend the briefing I'm about to have with Major Thompson. Your input on base operations and security procedures could be valuable." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "And I suspect there are aspects of your assignment here that warrant more thorough discussion." Elena nodded, setting her coffee tray aside and falling into step behind Martinez and Rodriguez as they headed toward the command post. But Rodriguez noticed that her demeanor had changed subtly. The quiet efficiency remained, but now it was accompanied by the kind of focused alertness that suggested she was preparing for significant developments. As they walked toward Major Thompson's office, passing soldiers who had no idea that their understanding of base personnel was about to be revolutionized, Martinez found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about military assignments and the utilization of special operations personnel. Elena Vasquez wasn't just another soldier marking time until discharge. She was a combat veteran whose qualifications had been hidden beneath routine duties, whose expertise had been overlooked because people saw what they expected to see rather than what was actually there. The coffee girl, it turned out, had depths that nobody had bothered to explore. Major Thompson was going to have some explaining to do about how a ghost wing veteran had been assigned to coffee distribution duties for 3 months without anyone recognizing her qualifications. But more importantly, Martinez was beginning to understand that forward operating Base Crimson had been wasting a valuable resource, and that oversight was about to be corrected. The revelation also raised questions about how many other qualified personnel might be languishing in support roles because their backgrounds weren't properly understood or their capabilities weren't being effectively utilized. Military bureaucracy was notorious for mismatched assignments, but this case suggested systemic problems with personnel evaluation and duty assignment procedures. As they approached the command post, Elena maintained her position behind the 2 senior men, but Rodriguez noticed that her bearing had shifted again. She was no longer moving like someone performing routine duties. She was moving like someone preparing for operational briefings, with the kind of situational awareness that came from years of training in environments where attention to detail could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The morning sun continued its climb toward another scorching day, but the temperature on forward operating Base Crimson was about to get considerably hotter as Colonel Martinez prepared to have a very interesting conversation with Major Thompson about personnel assignments, military qualifications, and the dangerous assumption that people who performed routine duties lacked exceptional capabilities. Elena had spent 3 months being invisible, defined by the menial tasks she performed rather than the qualifications she possessed. That invisibility was about to end, whether she wanted the attention or not. Sometimes the most effective disguise was doing exactly what people expected you to do until circumstances demanded that you reveal who you really were. The game was changing, and everyone involved was about to learn that assumptions about competence and qualification could be both dangerous and expensive. The coffee girl was about to become something else entirely, and forward operating Base Crimson was about to discover that they'd been overlooking a resource that could significantly enhance their operational effectiveness. Major Thompson's office occupied a reinforced trailer that had been modified to serve as a command center, with multiple communication systems, tactical displays, and the kind of security features that allowed for classified discussions. As Martinez, Rodriguez, and Elena approached the entrance, they could hear the familiar sounds of military administration, radio chatter, keyboard clicking, and the low conversation that characterized routine operational planning. Thompson himself was a career infantry officer in his early 40s, with the practical demeanor of someone who'd earned his rank through competent performance rather than political maneuvering. He'd been commanding Forward Operating Base Crimson for 8 months, and his leadership had resulted in efficient operations and high morale among the personnel under his command. When Rodriguez knocked on the doorframe and announced Colonel Martinez's arrival, Thompson immediately stood and moved to greet his visiting superior with the kind of professional courtesy that suggested confidence in his unit's performance. He was clearly prepared for an inspection, but not necessarily prepared for the kind of discussion that was about to occur. "Colonel Martinez, welcome to FOB Crimson," Thompson said, extending his hand for a firm handshake. "I trust your flight was comfortable, and I'm ready to provide whatever briefings or facility tours you require." Martinez returned the handshake, but his expression suggested that routine inspection procedures were no longer his primary concern. "Major Thompson, we need to discuss your personnel assignments, specifically the utilization of special operations veterans in support roles." Thompson's expression shifted from confident welcome to cautious puzzlement. "Sir, I'm not sure I understand the nature of your concern. Our personnel assignments follow standard procedures for skill matching and operational requirements." "Do they?" Martinez asked, gesturing for Elena to step forward. "Major, I'd like you to tell me about Specialist Vasquez's qualifications and current duty assignments." Thompson looked at Elena with the kind of casual acknowledgement that suggested he knew who she was, but hadn't given much thought to her background or capabilities. "Specialist Vasquez handles administrative support and logistical coordination, coffee service, filing, general assistance with routine tasks that keep operations running smoothly." "And her military background?" Martinez pressed, his tone suggesting that he already knew the answer but wanted to hear Thompson's assessment. "Standard enlistment, some specialized training, reassigned here following medical limitations that prevented continuation of previous duties," Thompson replied, clearly reading from mental notes based on superficial personnel file review. "Capable soldier, no disciplinary issues, performs assigned tasks competently." Martinez nodded slowly, then turned toward Elena with an expression that suggested the educational portion of this meeting was about to begin. "Specialist Vasquez, would you please inform Major Thompson about your operational background and unit assignments?" Elena came to attention, her posture shifting to the kind of formal military bearing that was used for official reports and briefings. "Sir, I served 3 years with Reconnaissance Squadron 7, conducting deep reconnaissance and intelligence gathering operations in classified theaters." Thompson's expression went through the same sequence of changes that had characterized Martinez's initial reaction: recognition, surprise, disbelief, and then the uncomfortable realization that he'd been making assumptions about qualifications based on incomplete information. "Ghost Wing," he said quietly, using the unofficial designation that carried more meaning than the formal unit name. "That's—" He stopped, clearly struggling to reconcile Elena's administrative duties with the implications of her operational background. "That's one of the most elite reconnaissance units in the military." Martinez finished for him. "Personnel with specialized training in long-range surveillance, target assessment, and deep penetration intelligence gathering." He paused, allowing the information to sink in. "And you've had her making coffee for 3 months." The observation carried the weight of professional criticism without being directly accusatory. Martinez understood that personnel assignments were based on available information, and that Elena's background might not have been properly communicated through official channels. But the misutilization of qualified personnel was exactly the kind of problem that his inspections were designed to identify and correct. Elena remained at attention, but Thompson noticed that she was studying the tactical displays and communication equipment in his office with the kind of professional interest that suggested familiarity with similar installations. Her gaze moved systematically across operational maps, communication protocols, and intelligence summaries with the analytical attention of someone who knew how to extract meaningful information from complex tactical presentations. "Specialist Vasquez," Thompson said, his voice taking on a different quality as he began to understand the scope of his oversight. "Why didn't you mention your operational background when you were assigned here?" Elena relaxed slightly from formal attention, but maintained professional bearing as she considered her response. "Sir, my assignment order specified administrative support duties. I assumed my previous experience wasn't relevant to current responsibilities." She gestured toward the tactical displays. "My medical limitations prevent return to operational status, so I focused on performing assigned tasks rather than discussing qualifications that no longer applied." The explanation was reasonable, but it highlighted systematic problems with personnel utilization that extended beyond individual assignments. Elena had been treated as generic administrative support rather than a qualified professional whose experience could enhance operational effectiveness, even within her medical limitations. Martinez walked over to study the tactical maps that covered one wall of Thompson's office, noting the level of detail and the complexity of operational planning that was evident from unit positions and mission timelines. "Major, what's your current assessment of intelligence gathering capabilities in your operational area?" Thompson followed his gaze to the tactical displays, clearly shifting mental gears to address operational questions rather than personnel issues. "We rely primarily on satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and reports from local contacts. Limited ground truth verification due to the security situation in contested areas." "Limited ground truth verification," Martinez repeated, then turned toward Elena. "Specialist, based on your operational experience, what would you identify as the primary intelligence gaps in this area of operations?" Elena studied the tactical maps for several seconds, her analysis systematic and thorough. When she responded, her voice carried the professional competence that comes from years of practical experience in intelligence assessment. "Sir, the satellite coverage shows good detail for fixed installations and vehicle movement, but limited information about personnel patterns and local population dynamics," she said, pointing to specific areas on the map. "The eastern sector here shows regular vehicle traffic, but we don't have assessment of whether that's legitimate commercial activity or potential hostile movement." She moved to another section of the map, her analysis becoming more detailed. "The northern approaches have good visibility for direct assault, but these residential areas could provide concealment for observation posts or weapons caches. Without ground reconnaissance, we're making assumptions about threat levels based on incomplete information." Thompson listened to Elena's assessment with growing amazement. Her analysis was more comprehensive and tactically sound than briefings he'd received from specialized intelligence personnel. She was identifying specific vulnerabilities and information gaps that his staff had either missed or inadequately addressed. "What would you recommend for improving intelligence collection in those areas?" Martinez asked, clearly testing Elena's analytical capabilities. "Short term, increase aerial surveillance with focus on personnel movement patterns rather than just vehicle traffic," Elena replied without hesitation. "Long term, establish covert observation posts with communications capability for real-time reporting. The terrain here and here," she pointed to elevated positions, "would provide good visibility while maintaining concealment." Her recommendations demonstrated understanding of both tactical principles and practical implementation challenges. She wasn't just identifying problems. She was proposing solutions that were both militarily sound and operationally feasible. Martinez turned back toward Thompson with an expression that suggested the educational portion of this meeting had concluded and the corrective action phase was beginning. "Major, I want Specialist Vasquez reassigned to intelligence analysis. Effective immediately. Her operational experience and analytical capabilities are being wasted on administrative duties." Thompson nodded, clearly understanding that this wasn't a suggestion but a direct order. "Yes, sir. I'll have new assignment orders prepared today." He paused, looking at Elena with newfound respect. "Specialist, I apologize for not recognizing your qualifications sooner. Your expertise will be much better utilized in intelligence operations." Elena accepted the acknowledgement with professional grace, but Martinez noticed that she didn't seem particularly surprised by the development. She'd probably been expecting something like this to happen eventually, once her background became known to people who understood the implications of Ghostwing service. "There's one more thing," Martinez said, his voice taking on the tone used for sensitive discussions. "Specialist Vasquez, your medical limitations. Are they permanent, or is there possibility for operational clearance if circumstances warranted?" Elena considered the question carefully, clearly weighing medical realities against professional possibilities. "Sir, the limitations are primarily physical endurance and mobility. I can't maintain the conditioning required for long-range reconnaissance. But analytical work and short-term operations within my medical profile would be feasible." The distinction was important. Elena wasn't completely disabled. She was restricted from the most physically demanding aspects of special operations work. But intelligence analysis, mission planning, and limited field work remained within her capabilities, especially in environments where her experience could provide significant advantages. Martinez nodded, filing the information for future reference. "Understood. For now, focus on intelligence analysis and operational planning. If opportunities arise for field work within your medical limitations, we'll address those as they develop." The meeting concluded with Thompson issuing immediate orders for Elena's reassignment and Martinez scheduling follow-up discussions about optimizing personnel utilization throughout the base. But as the participants prepared to leave the command post, Rodriguez found himself reflecting on how dramatically the morning had changed his understanding of assumptions and qualifications. Elena was no longer the mysterious coffee girl whose background remained undefined. She was a qualified intelligence professional whose expertise had been hidden beneath routine duties until circumstances forced recognition of her capabilities. The transformation had taken less than an hour, but its implications would affect operations at Forward Operating Base Crimson for months to come. As they exited the command post, Elena paused to look back at the tactical displays that would soon become her primary responsibility rather than casual observation. For 3 months, she'd watched other people analyze intelligence and plan operations while she performed administrative tasks. Now suddenly, she was being asked to contribute her expertise to mission planning and threat assessment. The change represented both opportunity and risk. Intelligence analysis would utilize her qualifications more effectively, but it would also increase her visibility and responsibility in ways that might affect the careful balance she'd maintained between competence and anonymity. Sometimes being underestimated was safer than being recognized for who you really were. But Colonel Martinez had made the choice for her, and Elena understood that her 3 months of invisibility were definitively over. Tomorrow would bring new responsibilities, new challenges, and new opportunities to demonstrate that competence came in many forms, often hidden beneath assumptions that prevented people from seeing what was right in front of them. The coffee girl was becoming something else entirely, and everyone at Forward Operating Base Crimson was about to learn that their most valuable assets weren't always the ones that announced themselves most loudly. Sometimes they were the ones who worked quietly in the background, waiting for someone with the experience to recognize what they were seeing. Elena Vasquez was about to discover whether recognition was worth the price of losing the anonymity that had protected her for 3 months. The game was changing, and the rules she'd learned to navigate were about to be replaced by new expectations and responsibilities that would test everything she'd learned about survival, competence, and the careful art of managing other people's assumptions about who she was and what she could do. The morning after Colonel Martinez's visit brought a different energy to Forward Operating Base Crimson. Word had spread through the informal communication networks that existed in every military installation, carried by whispered conversations during shift changes and speculative discussions over meals. Elena Vasquez was no longer just the woman who brought coffee. She was the Ghost Wing veteran who'd been hiding in plain sight for 3 months, and everyone wanted to understand what that meant for their assumptions about competence and qualification. Elena arrived at the intelligence section 30 minutes before her official start time, carrying a small kit bag that contained the personal items she'd need for analytical work. No coffee tray this morning, no routine administrative tasks to perform. Instead, she found herself approaching a workspace equipped with classified computer terminals, tactical displays, and secure communication equipment that she hadn't touched in 3 years. Technical Sergeant Lisa Park was already at her workstation, reviewing overnight intelligence reports with the kind of focused attention that characterized professional intelligence analysts. Park was a career soldier in her early 30s who'd built her reputation through accurate threat assessments and comprehensive mission planning. She looked up as Elena entered, her expression showing curiosity mixed with professional interest. "So you're our new analyst," Park said, gesturing toward an empty workstation that had been configured with appropriate security clearances and access protocols. "I have to admit, I'm interested to see what someone with your background brings to our operations." She paused, studying Elena with the analytical attention she typically reserved for enemy activity patterns. Ghost Wing has a reputation for seeing things that other people miss. Elena settled at her new workstation, noting that someone had already configured the systems with her security credentials and access levels. The computer terminals displayed current intelligence summaries, satellite imagery, and communications. Intercepts that represented the ongoing effort to understand enemy capabilities and intentions in their operational area. "I appreciate the welcome," Elena replied, beginning to familiarize herself with the analytical tools and information systems that would define her new responsibilities. "I'm looking forward to contributing something more substantial than coffee." Distribution. She pulled up a tactical map on her primary display. "What are the current priority intelligence requirements?" Park leaned back in her chair, clearly prepared to provide the kind of comprehensive briefing that would bring Elena up to speed on active operations and analytical priorities. "3 main areas of concern," she began, pointing to different sections of the tactical display. "Suspected weapons cache in the northern sector, irregular vehicle movement patterns along the eastern supply routes, and reports of increased coordination between local insurgent groups." Elena studied the map while Park continued her briefing, noting the locations and timelines that had generated concern among the intelligence staff. Her analytical training automatically began processing the information, looking for patterns and connections that might not be immediately obvious to observers without extensive field experience. "The weapons cache intelligence comes from a single human source with limited reliability," Park continued. "Satellite imagery shows no obvious signs of weapons storage, but the terrain provides good concealment opportunities. We need better confirmation before recommending any direct action." Elena zoomed in on the suspected cache location, studying the topographical features and access routes with the kind of systematic attention that came from years of planning reconnaissance missions. The area showed characteristics that would appeal to people who needed to store materials while avoiding detection, but it also presented challenges for anyone attempting surveillance or verification. What about electronic signatures? Elena asked, referring to the technical intelligence that could sometimes reveal hidden activities through communication patterns or equipment emissions. Are we monitoring radio traffic, cell phone activity, anything that might indicate regular access to this location? Park nodded approvingly, clearly pleased that Elena was asking relevant questions rather than requiring basic education about intelligence procedures. Limited electronic activity, but that could indicate either absence of weapons or good operational security by whoever's using the site. She pulled up additional displays showing communication intercepts and technical analysis. The lack of signatures might actually be suspicious, given normal patterns of activity in this area. Elena spent several minutes reviewing the technical intelligence, comparing it with her own knowledge of how clandestine organizations operated in contested environments. Her experience with Ghostwing had taught her that the absence of expected signatures could be just as significant as their presence, especially when dealing with sophisticated adversaries who understood counterintelligence techniques. "I'd like to review the full case file," Elena said, already beginning to develop analytical hypotheses that would require additional information to confirm or refute. Also, the original reporting that generated this requirement. Sometimes the context around initial intelligence is as important as the information itself. Park provided access to the classified files, noting Elena's systematic approach to information gathering analysis. Most new analysts wanted to jump immediately to conclusions or recommendations, but Elena was building a comprehensive understanding of the intelligence problem before attempting to propose solutions. Meanwhile, in other parts of the base, Elena's reassignment was generating conversations and reassessments that reflected the broader implications of discovering hidden qualifications among apparently routine personnel. The revelation that someone could possess extensive special operations experience while performing administrative duties had forced people to reconsider their assumptions about competence and capability. Private First Class Santos found herself thinking about Elena's transformation while performing her own communications duties. For 3 months, she'd accepted Elena's coffee service without wondering about her background or qualifications. Now suddenly, she was trying to reconcile the quiet administrative assistant with someone who'd conducted classified missions in hostile territory. "I keep thinking about those questions she asked during the briefing," Santos said to Specialist Mills during a break between communication monitoring shifts. "They weren't just good questions. They were specific, technical, like someone who'd actually done intelligence work before." Mills nodded, clearly struggling with her own reassessment of Elena's capabilities and qualifications. "I feel stupid for not seeing it," she admitted. Looking back, everything about her suggested military experience beyond basic training. The way she moved, the way she organized her equipment, even the way she took notes during briefings. The conversation reflected broader discussions, occurring throughout the base as personnel tried to understand how they'd missed obvious indicators of Elena's background and experience. The revelation was forcing people to examine their own assumptions about qualification and competence, and many were discovering that their powers of observation weren't as accurate as they'd believed. Staff Sergeant David Park, Technical Sergeant Lisa Park's husband, and the drone operator who'd initially questioned Elena's presence at operational briefings, found himself reviewing his own analytical capabilities with uncomfortable clarity. He'd spent 3 months observing Elena, without recognizing any of the indicators that should have suggested special operations background. "The thing that bothers me," he said to Specialist Reeves during equipment maintenance, "is that I pride myself on reading people accurately. It's part of my job as a drone operator to assess situations and personnel from limited information." He paused, checking connections on surveillance equipment with more attention than necessary. But I completely missed someone with her level of experience and qualifications. Reeves understood the implications of Park's discomfort. Military effectiveness depended on accurate assessment of people and situations, and Elena's concealed background represented a significant failure of observational skills that called into question their ability to evaluate other personnel and circumstances. Maybe that was the point, Reeves suggested. Maybe she was deliberately staying under the radar, and we saw exactly what she wanted us to see. He considered the possibility that Elena's administrative performance had been calculated to avoid attention rather than reflecting her actual capabilities. Could be that hiding in plain sight was intentional strategy. The hypothesis was plausible but unsettling. If Elena had deliberately concealed her qualifications, it suggested levels of operational thinking and strategic planning that extended far beyond administrative duties. It also raised questions about what other personnel might be maintaining similar operational security about their backgrounds and capabilities. Back in the intelligence section, Elena was beginning to develop comprehensive assessments of the current threat situation that drew on analytical techniques she'd learned during Ghostwing operations. Her approach differed significantly from standard intelligence procedures, incorporating methodologies that had been developed specifically for deep reconnaissance missions in hostile environments. I want to correlate the suspected weapons cache with historical patterns of insurgent activity, Elena explained to Park, pulling up databases that contained several years of tactical intelligence. Ghostwing missions taught me that current activities are usually connected to previous operations, even when the connections aren't immediately obvious. She began constructing timeline analyses that showed relationships between current intelligence requirements and historical events that had occurred months or even years earlier. The analytical framework was more sophisticated than standard threat assessment procedures, incorporating variables and relationships that weren't typically considered in routine intelligence work. Park watched Elena's analysis develop with growing admiration for both her technical skills and her analytical sophistication. That's a level of detail I've never seen applied to this type of problem, Park observed. Where did you learn those correlation techniques? Necessity, Elena replied, continuing to build complex analytical models that drew connections between apparently unrelated events and activities. When you're conducting reconnaissance behind enemy lines, you need to understand not just what's happening now, but how current activities relate to broader patterns of behavior and planning. Her analysis began revealing relationships and patterns that hadn't been apparent through standard intelligence procedures. The suspected weapons cache wasn't an isolated concern. It was part of a broader pattern of logistical preparation that suggested coordinated planning for future operations. Look at this, Elena said, highlighting specific data points on her analytical display. The vehicle movement patterns along the eastern routes correspond to times when human source reporting suggested increased activity near the cache location. But more importantly, both activities align with historical patterns that preceded previous attacks on coalition forces. Park studied Elena's analysis, recognizing the analytical sophistication that was revealing threats and connections that had been missed through routine intelligence procedures. This suggests coordinated preparation for something significantly larger than isolated weapons storage, Park said, understanding the implications of Elena's findings. Elena nodded, continuing to develop her analysis while accessing additional databases that might provide supporting information. The pattern suggests preparation for sustained operations rather than opportunistic attacks. This isn't someone hiding a few weapons for future use. This is systematic preparation for extended campaign activities. The assessment represented exactly the kind of analytical breakthrough that justified Elena's reassignment from administrative duties to intelligence work. Her background and experience were enabling her to see patterns and relationships that were invisible to analysts without her operational knowledge and specialized training. As word of Elena's analytical discoveries spread through the intelligence section, other personnel began seeking her input on analytical problems that had resisted solution through standard procedures. Her reputation was shifting from administrative assistant to valued analytical resource, and people who'd previously dismissed her capabilities were beginning to understand the expertise they'd overlooked. Master Sergeant Kelly, who'd observed Elena's transition from coffee distribution to intelligence analysis, stopped by her workstation to review her progress and assess how effectively she was adapting to her new responsibilities. Kelly had extensive experience evaluating personnel performance, and she was curious to see how someone with Elena's background would handle the transition from routine duties to complex analytical work. "How are you finding the adjustment?" Kelly asked, studying Elena's analytical displays and noting the sophistication of her work products. "Different from coffee distribution, I imagine." Elena looked up from her analysis, clearly energized by the opportunity to apply her expertise to meaningful problems. "Much more satisfying," she admitted. "I appreciate the opportunity to contribute. Something more substantial than caffeine delivery." She gestured toward her analytical displays. "This is work that requires the kind of experience and training I actually possess." Kelly nodded, understanding that Elena's previous assignments hadn't fully utilized her qualifications and capabilities. "Any regrets about maintaining low profile for 3 months? You could have been doing this work from the beginning if people had understood your background." Elena considered the question carefully, weighing the benefits of invisibility against the satisfaction of meaningful work. "Sometimes staying under the radar is safer than announcing your qualifications," she said finally. "Not everyone appreciates people who don't fit standard expectations about capability and experience." The observation reflected lessons Elena had learned through years of special operations work, where survival often depended on managing other people's perceptions and expectations. Sometimes the most effective strategy was allowing people to underestimate your capabilities until circumstances required you to demonstrate your actual qualifications. "Fair point," Kelly acknowledged. "But now that your capabilities are known, are you comfortable with increased visibility and responsibility?" Elena returned to her analytical work, clearly comfortable with her new role despite the increased attention and expectations that accompanied recognition of her qualifications. "I'm here to serve wherever I'm most useful," she said. "If that means intelligence analysis instead of coffee distribution, I'm prepared to adapt." As the day progressed, Elena's analytical work began generating intelligence products that significantly enhanced the base's understanding of threats and operational challenges in their area of responsibility. Her assessments were more comprehensive and tactically relevant than standard intelligence reports, incorporating insights that could only come from extensive operational experience in similar environments. Colonel Martinez returned to forward, operating Base Crimson in the late afternoon, interested to see how Elena's reassignment was progressing and what impact her expertise might have on operational effectiveness. He found her in the intelligence section, surrounded by analytical displays and working with the kind of focused intensity that characterized professionals who were fully engaged with meaningful work. "Specialist Vasquez," Martinez said, approaching her workstation with genuine interest in her progress. "How are you finding intelligence analysis after 3 months of administrative duties?" Elena stood and came to attention, but Martinez gestured for her to remain seated and continue her work. "Sir, much more compatible with my background and training," she replied. "I've been able to identify some patterns and relationships that weren't apparent through standard analytical procedures." Martinez studied her analytical displays, noting the sophistication of her work and the comprehensive nature of her threat assessments. "What have you discovered that changes our understanding of the operational environment?" Elena walked Martinez through her analysis, explaining the connection she'd identified between current intelligence requirements and historical patterns of enemy activity. Her briefing was comprehensive but concise, demonstrating both analytical competence and effective communication skills. The suspected weapons cache appears to be part of coordinated preparation for sustained operations, Elena explained, showing Martinez the data correlations that supported her assessment. The evidence suggests planning for extended campaign activities rather than isolated attacks. Martinez studied Elena's analysis with the kind of attention he typically reserved for strategic intelligence briefings. Her work was revealing threats and operational challenges that hadn't been apparent through routine intelligence procedures, and her recommendations could significantly affect mission planning and resource allocation decisions. This is exactly the kind of analytical work I hoped to see when I recommended your reassignment, Martinez said, clearly pleased with Elena's progress and the quality of her intelligence products. Your operational experience is enabling you to see patterns that other analysts are missing. Elena accepted the recognition with professional grace, but Martinez noticed that she seemed more interested in the work itself than in receiving praise for her performance. Her focus remained on the analytical problems she was trying to solve rather than on the personal recognition her expertise was generating. There's one more thing, Martinez continued, his voice taking on the tone used for sensitive discussions. Based on your analytical work and the threats you've identified, I'm wondering if you'd be interested in limited field operations within your medical restrictions. Elena paused her work to consider Martinez's suggestion, clearly weighing the opportunities against the risks and limitations that defined her current medical status. Field operations would represent a return to more active duties, but they would also expose her to physical demands that might exceed her medical restrictions. What kind of field operations? Elena asked, her tone suggesting interest tempered by realistic assessment of her capabilities and limitations. Observation post-establishment, site surveys for the locations you've identified in your analysis, Martinez explained. Short-term operations that would utilize your reconnaissance experience without requiring the physical demands of extended missions. The proposition represented exactly the kind of limited field work that could utilize Elena's expertise while remaining within her medical restrictions. It would also provide ground truth verification for her analytical assessments and enable her to contribute operational knowledge that couldn't be obtained through desk-based intelligence work. Elena considered the offer carefully, understanding that field operations would represent both professional opportunity and personal risk. Her Ghost Wing training and experience would be valuable for reconnaissance missions, but her medical limitations created vulnerabilities that hadn't existed during her previous operational career. I'd be interested in discussing the specifics, Elena said finally, within appropriate medical restrictions and with proper support arrangements. She looked back at her analytical displays. Some of these intelligence requirements really need ground verification that can't be obtained through technical collection methods. Martinez nodded, understanding that Elena's response reflected both professional enthusiasm and realistic assessment of her capabilities. We'll work out the details through appropriate medical and operational channels, he said. For now, continue developing your analysis. Your work is already having significant impact on our operational understanding. As Martinez prepared to leave the intelligence section, he paused to observe Elena returning to her analytical work with renewed focus and energy. Her transformation from administrative assistant to valued intelligence professional had been completed in less than 24 hours, but the impact of that change would affect operations at Forward Operating Base Crimson for months to come. Elena had demonstrated that competence and qualification could be hidden beneath routine duties and standard assumptions about capability. Her expertise had been invisible to people who saw what they expected to see rather than what was actually there, and her revelation had forced everyone on base to reconsider their assumptions about personnel evaluation and utilization. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward another desert evening when Elena finally paused her analytical work to consider how dramatically her circumstances had changed. 24 hours earlier, she'd been delivering coffee and performing administrative tasks that utilized none of her qualifications or experience. Now she was conducting intelligence analysis that drew on years of special operations training and contributing to mission planning that could affect lives and operational success. Technical Sergeant Park approached Elena's workstation as the shift was ending, carrying printouts of Elena's analytical products that she'd been reviewing throughout the afternoon. "I wanted to thank you for the analysis you've been developing," Park said. "Your work is revealing patterns and connections that we'd completely missed through standard procedures." Elena accepted the recognition with the same professional composure she'd maintained throughout her transition from administrative duties to intelligence work. "I'm glad to be contributing something more substantial than coffee distribution," she replied. "This is work that actually requires the experience and training I possess." Park nodded, understanding that Elena's previous assignments had represented significant underutilization of her qualifications and capabilities. "For what it's worth, I think everyone on base has learned something about assumptions and evaluation of personnel. Your situation has forced people to think more carefully about what they think they know about qualification and competence." The observation reflected broader changes that Elena's revelation had generated throughout forward operating Base Crimson. Her hidden qualifications had challenged comfortable assumptions about personnel evaluation and forced people to consider the possibility that other qualified individuals might be overlooked because they didn't fit standard expectations about competence and capability. As Elena prepared to secure her classified materials and end her first day as an intelligence analyst, she reflected on the complex dynamics of visibility and recognition that had defined her military career. For 3 months, she'd maintained invisibility through routine performance of assigned duties, avoiding attention that might complicate her situation or create unwanted scrutiny of her background. Now suddenly, she was highly visible, recognized, for qualifications that had been hidden beneath administrative tasks and standard assumptions about her role and capabilities. The change represented both opportunity and risk, providing meaningful work that utilized her expertise while exposing her to expectations and responsibilities that she hadn't faced since her medical separation from Ghost Wing. Specialist Mills approached Elena's workstation as she was completing her end-of-shift security procedures, clearly wanting to address the assumptions and attitudes that had characterized their interactions during Elena's 3 months of administrative duties. "Elena," Mills said, using her first name for the first time, "I wanted to apologize for the way I talked about your work and qualifications. I made assumptions about your background without ever bothering to learn who you actually were or what experience you had." Elena looked up from her security procedures, meeting Mills's gaze with the same steady composure that had characterized her response to 3 months of dismissive comments and casual mockery. "People see what they expect to see," Elena replied without anger or defensiveness. "That's not unusual, and it's not necessarily malicious." Mills nodded, but her expression suggested that she understood the broader implications of Elena's observation. "Still, I should have recognized that someone performing duties competently probably had qualifications beyond what was immediately obvious. Your questions during briefings, your attention to detail, your professional bearing. All of that should have suggested more experience than I was giving you credit for." Elena finished securing her classified materials and stood to face Mills directly. "The important thing is what people learn from experience," she said. "Today has provided education for everyone about assumptions and evaluation of personnel qualifications." The exchange reflected conversations occurring throughout the base as people tried to process the implications of Elena's revealed background and reassess their own capabilities for accurate evaluation of personnel and situations. Elena's hidden qualifications had served as an unexpected Lesson about the dangers of assuming that visible duties reflected actual capabilities. As Elena left the intelligence section and walked through the base toward her quarters, she observed the subtle changes in how people interacted with her. No longer invisible, no longer dismissed as irrelevant support staff, she was now recognized as someone whose expertise and experience warranted respect and professional consideration. The transformation felt both satisfying and somewhat uncomfortable. For 3 months, invisibility had provided protection from unwanted attention and unrealistic expectations. Now, recognition of her qualifications would bring increased responsibility and visibility that might complicate her efforts to serve out her remaining enlistment time without incident. But Elena had learned through years of special operations work that adaptation was essential for survival and success. Whether performing reconnaissance behind enemy lines or analyzing intelligence in support of base operations, effectiveness required the ability to adjust to changing circumstances and emerging opportunities. The evening call to prayer echoed across the desert landscape as Elena reached her quarters, the familiar sound serving as reminder that forward operating Base Crimson existed in a complex environment where cultural, political, and military realities intersected in ways that required constant awareness and professional competence. Elena had spent 3 months observing this environment, while performing routine duties that kept her largely invisible to the people around her. Now she would be contributing her expertise to understanding and responding to the challenges that defined operations in this contested region. Her coffee-making days were over, replaced by intelligence analysis that would utilize her training and experience in meaningful ways. The transformation had taken less than 24 hours, but its implications would affect both her own career prospects and the operational effectiveness of forward operating Base Crimson for the foreseeable future. As Elena prepared for sleep, she reflected on the complex balance between visibility and effectiveness that would define her remaining time in military service. Recognition of her qualifications provided opportunities for meaningful contribution, but it also created expectations and responsibilities that would require careful navigation. Tomorrow would bring new analytical challenges, new opportunities to contribute expertise that had been hidden for 3 months beneath routine administrative duties. Elena was ready for whatever came next, confident in her abilities and prepared to demonstrate that competence could take many forms, often concealed beneath assumptions that prevented people from seeing what was actually there. The most effective warriors, she'd learned, weren't always the ones who announced their capabilities most loudly. Sometimes they were the ones who worked quietly until circumstances demanded recognition of who they really were and what they could actually accomplish. When given the opportunity to utilize their full range of qualifications and experience, Elena Vasquez was no longer the coffee girl. She was a Ghost Wing veteran whose expertise would enhance forward operating Base Crimson's operational effectiveness for however long her assignment lasted. The revelation had changed everything, but Elena was prepared for whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.